Hi, boys and girls. I have the last couple chapters of our Flat Stanley book. This one's called, this chapter, Sneaky Plans. The next morning, Stanley awoke to more hand clapping. Sir Hawara was gathering his crew outside the camel's pen. Stanley lay between his blankets, thinking he had just had about enough of all the hand clapping. He wondered why someone hadn't told Sir Hawara how rude it was. As Stanley lay there thinking, he wasn't paying attention. He didn't notice that one of Sir Hawara's henchmen had come into the pen. The man grabbed the stack of blankets Stanley was lying in and started piling them on the camels. And before Stanley could scramble out, the guard threw a saddle over the blankets and helped Sir Hawara onto it. And so just as the sun was rising, Sir Hawara and a large group of his men took off for the pyramid of Khufufu, with Stanley along for the ride. If I hadn't been flattened already, Stanley thought, this would do the trick. As they rode along, Sir Hawara continued to discuss his sneaky plan with his men. With each thing he overheard, Stanley felt worse. We'll take everything, not just the scrolls. We'll pick that tomb clean as a lamb chop bone. Speaking of lamb chop bones, what about the flat boy? Stanley heard someone ask. He knows about the scrolls. What if he tells? Don't worry about him, Sir Hawara answered. Once he's unlocked the tomb, we don't need him anymore. We'll just seal him up in there. He can rot in that tomb for eternity with the other mummies, and no one will ever know. Locked inside a tomb with the mummies to rot for eternity? How he would miss his family, how he would miss his friends at school, even the mean ones. Stanley hoped that Amisi's father had gotten his note. The caravan stopped at the base of the pyramid, and everyone hurried off. Stanley worked his way out from under the blankets and followed them around to the back of the pyramid. Oh, there you are, Sir Hawara said, handing him a torch. Now, just like last time, open the door from inside for us. Got it? Stanley nodded, took the torch, and squeezed himself into the narrow slot. He worked his way along the passageway as quickly as he could and re-entered the tomb. Inside, he stopped at the base of the pharaoh's coffin. Try not to worry, he said out loud. If my plan goes well, they won't be gone for long. Stanley felt a little silly talking to a statue, but at the gloom, it almost looked as if the statue were smiling back at him. Stanley pressed the button again, unlocking the tomb. And there, waiting in the main passageway, were Sir Hawara and his men, laden with carts and boxes. Stanley put on his biggest smile as the crew rushed in. Just remember, follow the hieroglyphs to get out. Sir Hawara's crews rushed into the pharaoh's tomb, nearly knocking Stanley over. From the passageway, Stanley could hear them exclaim over the treasures. Sir Hawara ordered them to start stripping the tomb. If it's gold, take all you can hold. Take everything you can carry. This guy's been dead for 4,000 years. He won't miss anything. Follow the hieroglyphs and start loading the plane. It was time. Stanley extinguished his torch and covered himself all over with soot. He whispered Sir Hawara's chilling words to him. We'll just leave him to rot with the mummies for eternity, and felt himself break out into goose discs. He felt a cold sweat grow over them, and then he leaped up on the wall and froze there, stuck. Sir Hawara's crew ran out of the tomb, loaded with treasures. Sir Hawara shone his flashlight along the walls of the passageway. His beam fell upon Stanley. There's one, he called. Funny looking thing, but it's just like the flat kid said. It's pointing the way. Come on. He and his men rushed off. And there's Stanley, pretending to be a hieroglyph, leading them the wrong way. Stanley slipped down from the wall and made his way to the exit. As he stepped outside, he was delighted to see Amisi and her father waiting. We brought the police just as you asked, Amisi said. But what's this all about? Go on in, Stanley directed the police officers. I think you'll find this pyramid is loaded with looters, loaded with loot. And that is exactly what they did find. After a few moments, the officers began to come out of the pyramid with Sir Hawara and his henchmen and the stolen artifacts. There they are, stealing everything. Caught red-handed at last, Amisi and her father cried. And there they are, catching Sir Hawara. Stanley was especially happy to see Sir Hawara in handcuffs. There would be no more hand clapping from him for a while. Soon there was a big crowd around Stanley. So smart, so brave, so flat. People marveled when they found out the story. I was wrong when I said I was wrong about you, Amisi said. Stanley felt himself brush bright red and wondered how he hadn't noticed it before. Amisi was very pretty. Amisi's father came over and took a picture of the two of them with his instant camera. He gave the picture to Stanley. So you will always remember your visit. Then he shook Stanley's hand. You've captured Egypt's worst looter and saved the priceless giant scrolls of papyrus. Egypt's debt to you is enormous. How can we ever repay you? Say the word, whatever you want, it'll be yours. Before Stanley could answer, the little celebration was disturbed by a group of tourists. They were laughing and pointing at Stanley's camel. Look at the shape of that animal, Marge, cried one man. Absolutely ridiculous. Stanley knew too well how it felt to be poked fun of because of one shape. Hey, he called back, patting his camel. We don't get to choose what we look like. Stanley could almost hear his mother's voice say, hay is for horses, not for people. She would remind him if she were there now. She was always one for proper language. Or if she were really here in Egypt, she would probably say, hay is for camels. Suddenly, Stanley missed his family again, even more than the night before. Could you please just mail me back to America? He asked. Certainly, Amisi's father replied. Let's go inside and get you wrapped up now. The words made Stanley remember something. Just one more thing, he said. Back at the Lamb Chop residence, George Lamb Chop arrived home from work early. The office is being repainted. Just as well. I wasn't getting much work done. I keep wondering how Stanley's doing. He picked up the mail in the hall. There's a large package here from Egypt. Do you think? Yes, I know, Mrs. Lamb Chop said. For a moment, I was so excited I thought our dear boy was back. But it's addressed to Arthur, not to us. I think Stanley has only sent a souvenir home. I imagine you're right, Mr. Lamb Chop said, disappointed. Besides, the package is just lying there quietly. That couldn't be Stanley. Just then, Arthur came home from school. Mr. Lamb Chop noticed he looked very glum indeed. How about a game of Monopoly? Mr. Lamb Chop offered, or a walk in the park to watch the sailboats. Arthur shook his head. There's the package. It wouldn't be the same without Stanley here. Nothing's the same without Stanley here, he sighed. Well, this might cheer you up. Mr. Lamb Chop handed Arthur the package. He and Mrs. Lamb Chop watched as their son opened it. All three of them cried out in shock as a mummy sprang from the package. The mummy began reeling stiff-legged around the living room. Mrs. Lamb Chop almost fainted. Mr. Lamb Chop prepared himself to protect whomever might need protecting. Arthur stared with his mouth hanging open, and then he started to laugh. The mummy is a little flat. Mr. and Mrs. Lamb Chop stepped closer to look for themselves. It was true. Even under all the wrappings, it was clear that there was something oddly shaped about this mummy. Start unwrapping at once, called Mr. Lamb Chop. And so they did. Finally, after unwinding what seemed like miles of linen strips, there stood their own dear boy Stanley. What a surprise! There was great rejoicing and many hearty congratulations on Stanley's clever trick. Everyone talked at once. We'll remember that one for a long time. How did you ever manage to stay so still? Mrs. Lamb Chop remembered she had dinner cooking. Come to the table while it's hot, please. After the dinner was finished, Mrs. Lamb Chop decided the family had enough excitement for one day. Time for bed. Stanley was very happy to see his old bedroom with his spaceship lamp and his striped pajamas nearly folded on neatly folded on top of his pillow, just as he had left it. "It's good to be back," he told Arthur. Then he remembered the photograph Amici's father had taken. He pinned it up on his bulletin board. "That's Amici," Stanley told his brother. "What do you think of her?" "I think," Arthur looked at the photo puzzled, "I think she's a girl." Stanley got into bed, turned out his light. "That's what I think too, Arthur." He smiled in the dark. The end.